A frightened boy wouldn't sit still for more than a minute. Then the Hell's Angel saw the men. The rain came down hard. It hammered the roof of the Millbrook Interstate bus station like it had a grudge against the place. Water poured off the edges of the awning out front and splashed onto the cracked pavement below. The parking lot was mostly empty. A couple of old sedans sat near the entrance. A tired-looking pickup truck was parked sideways across two spots. And now, pulling in slowly beside the curb, was a motorcycle the size of a small bear. Frank Mercer cut the engine. He sat still for a moment, letting the quiet settle around him. Rain tapped against his helmet. He pulled it off and hooked it over the handlebar, then ran one large hand through his dark, graying hair. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, built like something that had been forged rather than born. His leather vest was covered in patches, worn soft from years of road and weather. Tattoos covered both arms from wrist to collar, dark ink twisting up his neck in thick bands. A scar cut through his left eyebrow, pale and old. He swung one leg off the bike and stood up straight. At 6'3", Frank Mercer had a way of making doorways feel small. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story. He wasn't in a hurry. He never was. He pulled his jacket tighter against the wet chill and walked toward the station entrance, boots heavy on the wet pavement. Above the glass door, a flickering sign read, Millbrook Bus Station in letters that had seen better days. He pushed through the door and stepped inside. The place smelled like old coffee and floor cleaner. It was the kind of station that hadn't been updated since the early 90s. Plastic chairs in faded orange and brown were bolted together in rows. A vending machine hummed in the corner. A chalkboard near the ticket window listed arrivals and departures in handwriting that was hard to read. A single ceiling fan turned slowly overhead, even though it was cold enough to need heat. There were maybe 8 or 9 people inside. A woman with 2 toddlers on her lap was asleep near the back wall. An old man in a fishing hat was reading a newspaper that looked 3 days old. A teenage girl with earbuds in was staring at the floor. A station worker in a blue vest leaned against the ticket counter, scrolling his phone. Frank moved straight toward the small coffee station near the far wall. He poured himself a cup. Black, no sugar. He wrapped both hands around it and let the warmth spread through his palms. Then he turned and looked for somewhere to sit. That was when he noticed the boy. He was small, 9 years old, maybe 10 at the most. He had dark hair that needed a trim, and it fell across his forehead in uneven pieces. He was wearing a gray hoodie that was a little too big for him, jeans with a small tear at the knee, and sneakers that had once been white. His backpack sat in his lap with both arms wrapped around it like he was hugging it. The boy was sitting 3 seats from the end of a row near the middle of the room. Frank picked a chair against the wall and sat down. He sipped his coffee. He watched the room the way he always did, quiet and easy, not staring at anything in particular but missing nothing either. 2 minutes passed. The boy stood up, moved down 1 row, and sat again. He looked at the entrance. He looked at the windows. He looked at the door to the men's restroom. Then he looked back at the entrance again. Frank kept his eyes forward. 3 minutes later, the boy moved again. This time he went 2 rows back and sat on the end seat closest to the wall. He tucked his feet up under himself. His knuckles were white where his hands gripped the backpack straps. Something shifted in Frank's chest. Not pity. Not quite. Something older than that. Something that came from years of seeing the world clearly enough to recognize when a person was truly scared. He kept watching. The boy moved again. Then again, The rain kept falling. The ceiling fan kept turning. And Frank Mercer kept his eyes on that child, still and patient as stone, his coffee going cold in his hand. By the time nearly an hour had passed, Frank had counted the boy change seats at least a dozen times. He never went far, always stayed within a certain stretch of the room, like he was pacing inside an invisible fence. Every time the front door opened, the boy's head snapped up. His whole body went rigid. He would watch whoever walked in until they moved away, and only then would his shoulders drop back down. Frank set his cup on the seat beside him. He had seen nervous before. He had seen fidgety kids and bored kids and kids who were just plain tired. This wasn't any of that. This was something else. This was a child who was watching every door like something bad was going to walk through one of them. Frank stood up slowly. He was careful about how he did it. Slow and easy, the way you move around something fragile. He straightened his vest, tucked his thumbs into the front pockets of his jeans, and started walking toward the boy. Frank stopped a few feet away. He didn't crowd the boy. He kept some space between them and crouched down a little, bringing himself closer to eye level. It wasn't something he thought about. It just felt right. "Hey," he said. His voice was low, steady, the kind of voice that didn't push. The boy looked up fast, the way a rabbit looks up when it hears a twig snap. His eyes were dark brown and wide, and for just a second Frank could see everything in them. Fear, exhaustion, something else too, something careful and measuring, like the boy was already deciding whether to run. Then the eyes dropped back down to the floor. "I'm Frank," he said. He didn't reach out a hand. He just let his name sit there in the air between them. "You doing all right?" The boy gave a small shrug. One shoulder. "Barely anything." "You waiting on somebody?" A short shake of the head. "Just the once." Frank nodded slowly, like that answer was perfectly fine. He glanced around the station the way a man does when he's not really looking at anything important. Then he looked back at the boy. "You want me to find somebody who works here? Help you out?" Another shake. Quicker this time. More certain. Frank studied the kid for a moment. The backpack was still pulled tight against his chest. The boy's jaw was set in a hard little line that didn't belong on a face that young. His sneakers pressed flat against the floor like he was ready to push off and sprint at any second. "Okay," Frank said simply. He didn't push. He didn't pull out his phone and threaten to call anyone. He didn't ask the boy his name or where he came from or where his parents were. He just said okay, and let it be what it was. He straightened back up to his full height. He saw the boy's shoulders tighten when he did, like the kid expected something to happen. Frank took one slow step back, and then another. He turned without rushing and walked back toward his seat against the wall. He picked up his coffee cup, found it had gone fully cold, and set it back down. He sat. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked down at the floor for a moment. Outside, the rain was still going strong, streaking down the big plate glass windows at the front of the station in long silver lines. He lifted his eyes toward those windows. There were two men standing outside under the narrow glass shelter that ran along the front of the building. Most people who stood out there were watching the road, checking for their bus, maybe looking at their watch. These two weren't doing any of that. They were both in dark jackets. One was taller, thick through the neck, with short gray hair pushed flat against his head by the rain. The other was younger, leaner, standing with his hands in his pockets and his chin slightly down. They weren't talking to each other much. Just standing, just watching. Frank followed the line of their gaze. It led straight to the boy. He leaned back slowly in his seat. He didn't move his head. He kept his face easy and his body relaxed, and he watched the two men the same way he had watched the boy, steady and quiet, letting his eyes do the work without making it obvious. Every time the boy shifted seats, Frank checked the window. The taller man adjusted his position. Just slightly, just enough. The younger one turned his head to track the movement, then went still again. They weren't waiting for a bus. They weren't checking arrivals. They weren't looking at the schedule board, or talking on their phones, or doing any of the ordinary things that ordinary people do when they're passing through a bus station on a rainy afternoon. They were watching that child. And they had been doing it long enough that they'd gotten comfortable doing it. Frank's jaw tightened. Just once. Then his face went smooth and still again. He did not look away from the window. Frank didn't move. He sat with his back against the wall, and his big arms resting loose across his knees, and he watched the two men through the rain-streaked glass, like he had all the time in the world. The tall one with the gray hair was named something, probably. Had a house somewhere, probably. A car parked around the corner, probably. But right now all he was doing was standing in that narrow shelter and keeping his eyes on a 9-year-old boy inside a bus station. Frank had learned a long time ago that you could tell a lot about a person by watching what they did when they thought nobody was paying attention. These two weren't paying attention to Frank at all. He was just a big biker drinking cold coffee against the far wall. Easy to dismiss. Easy to overlook. That was fine with him. He heard the scrape of rubber soles behind him as the boy moved again. Third seat in 10 minutes, this time sliding further down the row, putting more distance between himself and the door on the left side of the building. Frank kept his eyes on the window. The tall man took 2 steps to the right. Slow. Casual. Like he was just stretching his legs. He stopped when the boy stopped. The younger one tilted his head by about an inch, recalibrated, settled back into stillness. There it was. Frank let out a slow breath through his nose. He'd seen this kind of movement before. Not here. Not in a place like this. But he had seen it. The way a person positions their body to maintain a clear line of sight without making it look like that's what they're doing. It wasn't something most people would catch. It wasn't dramatic. There were no sharp movements, no obvious signals passing between the two men. That was exactly what bothered him. Amateurs were sloppy. They stared too long and moved too fast and gave themselves away inside of 30 seconds. These two were not amateurs. They moved with the kind of patience that came from practice, the kind of stillness that meant they knew how to wait. The rain came down harder for a moment, and the windows blurred with it, turning the two men into dark shapes behind a sheet of gray water. Then it eased off again, and there they were, right where they'd been, still watching. Frank picked up his coffee cup just to have something to do with his hands. He didn't drink from it. He just held it and looked at the window and thought things through with the careful, unhurried part of his mind that had kept him out of serious trouble more times than he could count. The boy wasn't being dramatic. He wasn't a kid throwing a fit or playing some kind of game. Everything about him, the way he sat, the way he held that backpack, the way his eyes moved, was purposeful, controlled. Like he had thought all of this out beforehand. He was hiding, and those men had found him. Frank set the cup back down. He shifted in his seat just enough to get a better angle on the boy without being obvious about it. The kid was 3 rows over now, sitting sideways with his back partially to the wall, his feet pulled up onto the bench. His chin was low, his eyes were aimed at the floor. But they weren't. They were aimed at Frank. The boy was watching him from underneath the brim of his hood, just barely. watching Frank the same way Frank had been watching the men outside. Careful, quiet, measuring. And then Frank understood something. The boy had seen him watching the two men through the window. He had been tracking Frank's gaze and figured out what Frank was looking at. He had put it together, this big, tattooed stranger sitting alone and watching the window with a face like stone. The boy knew that Frank knew. Something moved across the kid's face then, quick as a shadow. Fear, yes, the same fear that had been there all along. But underneath it, almost hidden, was something small and fragile and desperate. Relief. Frank didn't make a big deal out of it. He just stood up quietly, walked over to the small vending counter near the far wall, and bought 2 sandwiches wrapped in plastic. Turkey and cheese. Nothing fancy. He carried them back to his seat and set one on the bench beside him. Then, without looking at the boy, he stood up again and walked the second sandwich over to the empty bench closest to where the kid was sitting. He set it down gentle, like it was nothing, like he was just setting down a piece of paper. He didn't say a word. Didn't look at the boy, just turned around and walked back to his own seat and picked up his coffee. He didn't watch to see what happened next. That was the point. He already knew that any kind of pressure, even something as small as a hopeful look, would be enough to make the kid pull back completely. So he looked at the rain instead, watched it trail down the glass in slow, crooked lines. A few minutes passed. Then he heard the faint crinkle of plastic wrap. Frank took a sip of his coffee and said nothing. The sandwich was gone by the time he glanced over again. The boy was sitting with his knees pulled up to his chest, chewing slowly, watching the door on the far side of the building. His grip on the backpack had loosened just a little. Not much, but a little. Small things mattered. Frank had learned that a long time ago. Big gestures made people nervous. Small ones made them feel safe. A sandwich left on a bench with no strings attached was not a threat. It was just a sandwich. The afternoon wore on. The rain didn't quit. A few people came through the station, shook the water off their jackets, checked the boards, and left. The 2 men outside had moved under the shelter again, shoulders hunched against the cold. They weren't going anywhere. Neither was Frank. He had nowhere to be. He had learned that a long time ago, too. The road would still be there tomorrow. Schedules were for people with something waiting on them. Around 5 o'clock, the station lights flickered on. The sky outside had gone from gray to the kind of dark purple that meant evening was coming in fast. The fluorescent light buzzed faintly overhead and turned everything a little pale. Frank had just closed his eyes for a minute, not sleeping, just resting them, when he heard a small voice. That was good. He opened his eyes. The boy was 2 benches closer than he had been before. He was still holding the backpack, still sitting tight, but he had moved. On his own, without Frank doing anything at all. Frank nodded once. Glad. The boy looked at him for a moment. Really looked. His eyes were dark brown and very serious for a kid his age. There were shadows under them that had nothing to do with the lighting. I'm Oliver, the boy said. Frank said. Oliver nodded slowly, like he was filing that away somewhere. Then he was quiet again. He looked down at his sneakers and turned something over in his mind. Frank could almost see him doing it, working up to something, choosing his words the way careful people do when they're about to ask something that really matters to them. Then Oliver looked up. Do you think, he said, and his voice came out a little smaller now, a little more careful, all adults tell the truth? He wasn't asking to make conversation. There was nothing casual about the question. It came out of a real place, A place that had been hurt before, more than once probably, by someone who was supposed to be trustworthy. Frank looked at the boy steadily. He didn't answer right away. Not because he didn't know what he wanted to say, but because a question like that deserved a real answer, not a quick one. Oliver waited. His eyes didn't move from Frank's face. Frank let the silence sit for a moment longer. Then he said, "No." Oliver blinked. "Not all of them," Frank said. "Some do, some don't, same as anybody else." Oliver seemed to think about that. He pulled at a loose thread on the strap of his backpack. "How do you know which ones are which?" Frank looked at him steady. "You watch what they do, not what they say." The boy went quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now, less like a wall and more like he was actually turning something over, considering it. The station had emptied out a good bit since the dinner hour rolled through. A woman with a rolling suitcase had caught her bus 20 minutes ago. An older man in a green coat had fallen asleep across a bench near the restrooms, his chin on his chest. The guy behind the ticket counter was flipping through something on his phone, not paying attention to much of anything. The buzzing of the fluorescent lights felt louder now that most of the noise was gone. Oliver shifted on his bench. He set the backpack on his lap instead of beside him, which was something new. He was still holding it. But the way he held it had changed just slightly. Less like he was protecting it, more like he just needed something familiar to hold on to. "My mom used to say something like that," he said quietly. Frank didn't push. He just waited. "She said you can tell a lot about a person by what they do when nobody's watching." Oliver's voice got a little softer toward the end of that, like saying it out loud cost him something. Frank nodded once. "She sounds like a smart woman." Oliver didn't answer that. He just looked at the floor. Frank understood. He didn't press. They sat like that for a little while. The rain had slowed outside. It wasn't coming down hard anymore, just a steady gray drizzle that fogged up the lower half of the windows and made the parking lot lights smear into soft orange blurs against the glass. Frank glanced toward the shelter outside without making it obvious. The two men were still there. They had moved apart a little. One was leaning against the far post, arms crossed. The other was standing closer to the entrance, turned slightly sideways, like he was watching the road. But he wasn't watching the road. Frank had caught him twice now looking straight through the glass at Oliver. Frank looked back at his coffee cup. It had been empty for a while. "Those guys been out there long?" Oliver asked. Frank looked over at him. The boy was staring at his own reflection in the rain-blurred window. "Long enough," Frank said. Oliver's jaw tightened just a little, just enough that Frank caught it. "You know them?" Frank asked. He kept his voice easy, no pressure behind it. A long pause followed. Oliver's fingers moved on the straps of his backpack. He chewed the inside of his cheek. Then he nodded. Frank waited. "They work for my grandfather," Oliver said. His voice was flat and quiet, not angry, just tired, the kind of tired that goes deeper than not sleeping enough. Frank felt something loosen in his chest. Okay, that changed things. Family situation. A kid who ran off. A worried grandfather who sent people to bring him back. It wasn't the first time something like that had played out. Families were complicated. Kids ran. Adults panicked and sent the wrong people to fix it. He looked at the two men again, through the glass. They weren't in uniform. They weren't police. But they were here, and they were waiting. And if they were just trying to get a 9-year-old home safely, maybe this whole situation was simpler than it had started to look. Maybe the boy had just gotten scared about something at home. Maybe the grandfather was worried sick. Maybe there was a family that needed putting back together. And the hardest part was already done, because at least everyone was in the same place now. Frank exhaled slowly. Maybe this was going to be all right after all. Frank pushed through the side door and stepped out into the cool night air. The drizzle had softened to almost nothing. Just a light mist now, the kind that settled on your skin without you really noticing until everything felt damp. He pulled out a cigarette and lit it, cupping his hand around the flame until it caught. He took a long drag and let the smoke out slow. He stood near the corner of the building, just outside the reach of the yellow light above the door. From where he was standing, he could still see through the window. Oliver was on his bench, still holding the backpack, still watching the room the way a small animal watches an open field before crossing it. Frank looked toward the shelter. The two men had moved. They were standing beside a dark blue sedan parked at the far edge of the lot, maybe 40 feet from where Frank was. They had their backs mostly to him. One of them was on his phone. The other was talking, low and steady, the way people talk when they don't want to be overheard. Frank took another drag. He stayed where he was and kept still. The one on the phone put it away. He said something Frank couldn't make out. The other one shook his head and said something back. Their voices were quiet, but the parking lot was quiet too, and the mist had a way of carrying sound flat across open pavement. Frank didn't move toward them. He just stood in the shadow near the wall and kept his breathing easy. Then the wind shifted just slightly. "I've been in there too long?" That was the taller one, the one who had been standing closest to the entrance earlier. His voice was low and a little rough around the edges. "We need to wrap this up." The other one, the one who had been on the phone, crossed his arms. Bennett said quiet, "No scene." "I know what Bennett said." "Then act like it." A pause. The taller one looked toward the station windows. Frank stayed completely still. "Kid's 9 years old," the shorter one said. His tone wasn't gentle, it was just practical. "We walk in calm. We tell him Grandpa's waiting. We get him in the car. Simple." "And if he doesn't come?" The shorter one didn't answer that right away. He reached up and adjusted the collar of his jacket. "He'll come." Last time somebody said that, the kid hid in a bathroom for 2 hours. Last time, Webb handled it. Webb's an idiot. The taller one made a low sound that wasn't quite a laugh. He looked back toward the windows again. "What if someone in there makes it difficult?" "Then it gets less quiet." The shorter one said it the same way someone might say they'd have to take a different route because of traffic. No emotion in it, no hesitation, just fact. But either way, that kid doesn't walk out of there on his own. His grandfather can't afford for him to start talking. Frank's hand stopped halfway to his mouth. He stood very still. The cigarette burned between his fingers. "Start talking about what?" the taller one said. "You don't need to know what." "Ross, you don't need to know." The shorter one, Ross, said it firm and final. "What you need to know is we put him in that car tonight. That's the whole job." The taller one said nothing after that. He just nodded once and looked back at the sedan. Frank dropped the cigarette and pressed it out under his boot. He didn't rush. He turned back toward the side door the same way he had come out, calm and steady, nothing quick about it. He pulled the door open and stepped back inside. The warm, stale air of the station wrapped around him. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Oliver was still on his bench, eyes up, watching the door the second Frank came through it. Frank walked back to his seat and sat down. His jaw was tight. His hands were loose and open on his knees. The boy was in genuine danger. Frank didn't look at the men through the window. He didn't need to anymore. He already knew what they were planning. He looked at Oliver instead. The boy had his backpack pulled tight against his chest now, both arms wrapped around it like it was the only solid thing left in the world. His eyes were on Frank, waiting, searching his face the way kids do when they're trying to figure out if the news is good or bad before anyone says a word. Frank leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. He kept his voice low and level. "Hey," he said, "I need you to listen to me for a second." Oliver gave a small nod. "Those men out there." Frank paused, choosing his words carefully. "I heard them talking." Something moved across Oliver's face, a flicker, like a candle in a draft. "They're planning to put you in that car tonight," Frank said. "Whether you want to go or not." For a moment, Oliver didn't react at all. He just sat there, very still, his arms tightening around the backpack. Then his chin started to tremble. It was small at first, barely noticeable, but then his shoulders pulled in, and his breath came out shaky and broken, and the tears came fast. He didn't make much sound, just quiet, desperate crying. The kind that comes from someone who has been holding everything in for so long that when it finally breaks loose, there's almost nothing left to hold back with. Frank didn't reach for him. He didn't rush. He just sat close and let the boy feel it. After a little while, Oliver wiped his face roughly with the back of his hand. He sniffled hard. "I've been scared for 4 days," he whispered. "I know," Frank said. "I didn't know where to go." Oliver's voice cracked on the last word. "My mom always knew what to do. She always knew." Frank felt something heavy settle in his chest. "She sounds like she was a real good person." Oliver nodded and pressed his lips together tight, fighting back another wave. He breathed in deep through his nose and steadied himself. Then he looked down at the backpack. He was quiet for a moment. Then he unzipped it. He reached past a crumpled hoodie and a water bottle and pulled out a large brown envelope. It was bent at one corner and soft from being handled. He held it out toward Frank. Frank took it carefully and opened the flap. Inside were papers, printed emails, financial documents, pages covered in numbers and names and account codes. There were handwritten notes in the margins in small, neat handwriting. The kind of notes someone writes when they're trying to understand something that doesn't add up. "My mom ran a charity," Oliver said. His voice was quieter now, steadier. "For sick kids. She started it herself. She ran it for 6 years." He paused. Before she got really sick, she started noticing that money was disappearing. A lot of money. She thought it was her dad, my grandpa. Oliver looked at the papers in Frank's hands. "She saved all of that. She printed everything and she hid it. I found it after she died, in a box under her desk. I didn't know what to do with it." Frank looked at the pages slowly. He wasn't a financial expert, but he could see enough. Account transfers, large amounts, dates, names. It was all there, laid out carefully, like Oliver's mother had known someday someone else would need to follow the trail she left behind. He slid the papers back into the envelope and handed it back to Oliver. "You hold on to that," Frank said. Oliver took it and hugged it to his chest along with the backpack. Frank stood up. He looked at the front windows without turning his head too far. Ross and the other man were still out there. He looked back down at Oliver. "Nobody is taking you anywhere you don't want to go," Frank said. "You hear me? Nobody." Oliver looked up at him. His eyes were still wet, but something in them had shifted. Something steadier had taken hold. Frank held out his hand. "Come on. We're going out the back." Oliver stood up, grabbed his backpack, and took Frank's hand. They moved toward the rear of the station as the last pale light faded from the sky outside. The rear exit opened into a narrow alley that smelled like wet concrete and old trash. Rain came down steady and cold. Frank pulled his leather jacket off and draped it over Oliver's shoulders without a word. It swallowed the boy whole, hanging past his knees, the sleeves flopping well past his hands. Oliver looked up at him. "Thank you," he said quietly. Frank gave a short nod and moved them along the alley wall, staying close to the building. The parking lot was on the other side of the station. Ross and the other man were somewhere near the front. Frank kept that picture in his mind as he guided Oliver toward the far end of the alley where his motorcycle waited under a rusted overhang. He crouched down to Oliver's level. Rain dripped from the brim of his cap. "You ever been on a motorcycle before?" Oliver shook his head. "It's loud," Frank said, "but it won't hurt you. You hold onto my jacket and don't let go. You lean when I lean, don't fight it." He paused. "Can you do that?" Oliver pulled the big jacket tighter around himself and nodded. They climbed on. Frank fired up the engine and it rumbled deep and loud under them. Oliver flinched at the sound, but held on tight, both small hands gripping the back of Frank's belt. Frank pulled out slow, headlight off for the first 30 seconds, rolling through the dark alley and swinging left onto a side street that ran away from the station. He didn't touch the main road. He took back roads. Narrow county routes that cut between cornfields and tree lines, roads that didn't show up easily on maps, and that nobody followed unless they already knew where they were going. The rain kept falling. The headlight carved a pale tunnel through the dark. Oliver pressed close against Frank's back, his head down against the wind. Frank drove for about 20 minutes before he pulled over under a wide oak tree at the edge of a gravel turnoff. He cut the engine. The rain tapped quietly on the leaves above them. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to a name. Denny Holt. They had known each other for almost 15 years. Denny had left the road behind a long time ago and now ran a small motel off Route 9, a plain and quiet place that mostly served truckers and hunters. No cameras at the entrance, no questions asked. Good man. The phone rang twice. "Yeah." Denny's voice was rough and familiar. "It's Tank. I need a room tonight, just one. Me and a kid." A short pause. "A kid?" "Long story, he's safe. He just needs somewhere to sleep." Another pause, shorter this time. "Room 7, back of the lot. I'll leave the key under the mat." "I owe you." "You owe me about 40 things," Denny said. "One more don't matter." Frank put the phone away. He looked back at Oliver, who was peering out from under the big jacket collar like a turtle from its shell. "We've got a place to stay tonight," Frank said. Oliver's shoulders dropped about an inch. It was a small thing, but Frank noticed it. They rode the rest of the way in the rain. Denny's motel was exactly as Frank remembered. A long, low building with yellow doors and a gravel lot, and a single floodlight near the office that hummed faintly in the wet air. Room 7 was at the far end, tucked back from the road, shadowed by a pair of pine trees. The key was under the mat. Inside, the room was small and plain. 2 beds with faded blue covers, a lamp on the nightstand that gave off warm yellow light, a radiator in the corner that ticked and hissed when Frank turned it on. It smelled like old wood and clean sheets. Oliver sat down on the nearest bed and pulled off his wet shoes. He still had Frank's jacket around him. He lay back against the pillow slowly, like someone who hadn't trusted a soft surface in days. Within minutes, his eyes were closed. His breathing evened out. His hands finally loosened their grip on the backpack beside him. Frank pulled the chair from the small desk and set it near the door. He sat down. He rested his forearms on his knees and listened to the rain outside. He wasn't going anywhere. Oliver made a sound in his sleep. Not loud, just a small, broken kind of noise, like something caught in his chest trying to get out. Frank was awake in the chair before it finished. He watched the boy twist against the blanket, his face tight, his fingers clutching the edge of the pillow. "Hey." Frank kept his voice low and even. "Hey, kid." Oliver's eyes snapped open. He sat straight up, breathing hard. For a second, he didn't know where he was. His eyes jumped around the room, taking it all in fast. The yellow lamp, the blue curtains, the rain, quieter now against the window. Then he saw Frank sitting in the chair by the door, and something in his face settled. He let out a slow breath. "Bad dream?" Frank asked. Oliver nodded. He rubbed his face with both hands and sat there for a moment, just breathing. Frank didn't ask what the dream was about. Some things didn't need to be pressed on. "You hungry?" he said instead. Oliver thought about it, and then nodded again, more firmly this time. "Good." Frank stood and stretched his back. "Get your shoes on." The diner was called May's. It sat about a quarter-mile down the road from the motel, a squat little building with a red roof and a hand-painted sign that had weathered down to soft, faded letters. A bell rang above the door when they walked in. The place smelled like bacon grease and fresh coffee and warm syrup, all of it wrapped together in the best possible way. A woman with gray-streaked hair and a yellow apron looked up from behind the counter. Her eyes moved from Frank to Oliver and back to Frank. Frank was used to that look, that quick, measuring glance. He just pulled out a booth near the window and sat down. After a moment, she came over with menus and coffee. "Milk for him," Frank said. She brought it without comment. Oliver studied the menu very seriously, the way kids do when they haven't eaten properly in too long, and suddenly everything looks important. He ended up ordering pancakes and scrambled eggs and orange juice. Frank ordered eggs and toast and black coffee. When the food came, Oliver ate steadily and quietly for a few minutes, working through the pancakes like he had a job to finish. Frank drank his coffee and watched the road through the window. The rain had stopped some time before dawn. The morning outside was gray and still damp, but the heavy clouds were breaking apart at the edges. Oliver set his fork down after a while and looked at the table. "My mom started the charity when I was 5, he said. Frank looked at him. It was for kids in foster care. She used to say they needed things that nobody thought to give them. He paused. Like books and birthday cakes and somebody to show up for their school stuff. His voice was even, but careful, like he was handling something delicate. She ran it out of the community center. People donated money and she kept all the records herself because she said she wanted to know exactly where everything went. He picked at the edge of his napkin. She was sick for almost a year before she died. But she kept working, even at the end. Frank stayed quiet. He knew when to be still. About 2 months before she died, she started acting different, worried. Oliver looked up. She wouldn't tell me what was wrong, but I heard her on the phone one night. She was talking to someone and she kept saying the numbers weren't adding up, that things were missing. He looked back at the table. She sounded scared. He said the last word quietly. And after she died, I was going through her stuff. I found a folder she had hidden inside an old book on her shelf. He glanced towards the backpack sitting on the seat beside him. That's what's in there, everything she found. Oliver pushed his empty plate to the side and folded his hands on the table. Frank looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded toward the backpack. Can I see them? He asked. The files. Oliver hesitated. Just a breath. Then he unzipped the front pocket and pulled out a thick folder held together with a rubber band. He slid it across the table carefully, like it was made of something fragile. Frank set down his coffee mug and picked it up. He pulled off the rubber band and opened the folder flat on the table. Inside were printed pages, handwritten notes, and what looked like bank statements. Some pages had yellow highlighter marks across certain numbers. Others had small notes written in the margins in neat, careful handwriting. The kind of handwriting that belonged to someone who paid attention to details. He went through the first few pages slowly. The documents weren't hard to follow once you understood what you were looking at. A charity account, deposits coming in from donors, regular withdrawal amounts that matched program expenses, food, books, event costs. That all made sense. But then the pattern changed. There were transfers, not small ones. Amounts moved out of the charity account and into a separate business account. The name on that business account appeared several times near the bottom of one page. Frank read it twice to make sure. Bennett Holdings, LLC. He knew that name. Oliver had mentioned it the night before. It was his grandfather's company. Frank set the page down and looked at the next one. It was a printed email chain. The top message was from someone named Carl, who Frank figured worked for the grandfather based on the tone of the writing. The message was short. It said the adjustments had been made and that the quarterly report would reflect the approved numbers. The reply below it had 3 words. Good. Keep going. No signature. But the email address was listed at the top. Frank read it. Then he closed the folder and held it closed with his hand for a moment. He looked at Oliver across the table. The boy was watching him the way kids watch adults when they're waiting to find out if something is really as bad as they think it is. Frank didn't sugarcoat it. Your mom did good work putting this together, he said. Oliver's jaw tightened a little. Is it enough? Frank thought about that honestly. The documents looked real. The pattern was clear once you laid it all out. But he also knew that people with money, and lawyers, and influence had a way of making clear things look complicated very quickly. It's a strong start, he said. But we need somebody who knows what to do with it. Somebody with the right kind of experience. Oliver nodded slowly. He reached out and took the folder back and held it against his chest for a second before sliding it back into the backpack. Frank picked up his coffee. It had gone mostly cold. He drank it anyway and looked out the window at the wet parking lot while he thought. He ran through the short list of people he genuinely trusted. It wasn't a long list. Years of living on the outside of things had a way of trimming it down. But one name sat near the top without any argument. Ray DeLuca. Ray had put in 30 years with the state police before a bad knee and a worse captain pushed him into retirement. He was sharp, stubborn, and completely unimpressed by money or reputation. Frank had known him for almost 15 years through a mutual friend. Ray had done Frank a quiet favor once, and never asked for anything back. That kind of thing stuck. Frank pulled out his phone and found the number. It rang 4 times. Then a rough voice answered. Wasn't expecting to hear from you. I've got something serious, Frank said. I need an hour of your time today, face to face. A pause on the other end. Not a long one. Where are you? Frank told him. They agreed on a location, a quiet spot Ray knew about, and a time. Late afternoon. Frank set the phone down and looked at Oliver. We've got a meeting, he said. Ray DeLuca lived about 40 minutes outside of town on a gravel road that wound through a stretch of flat farmland. His house was small and plain, with a covered porch and a rusted weather vane on the roof that pointed east no matter which way the wind blew. He was already standing on the porch when Frank pulled up. Ray was in his late 60s with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of posture that never fully left a man after 30 years in uniform. He wore a flannel shirt and work boots. His eyes moved to Frank first, and then immediately to Oliver sitting beside him. He didn't say anything right away. He just held the door open and gestured them inside. The living room was neat and simple. A couch, 2 chairs, a low table, bookshelves along one wall, a radio on the kitchen counter that was playing something low and quiet. Ray turned the radio off and pulled a chair around so the 3 of them could sit facing each other. "Show me what you got," he said. Oliver looked at Frank. Frank gave him a small nod. The boy unzipped the backpack and laid the folder on the table. Ray put on a pair of reading glasses and went through the documents without rushing. He turned pages carefully. He went back to certain ones more than once. He held the email printouts closer to the lamp and read them slowly. Nobody spoke while he worked. Oliver sat with his hands pressed between his knees and his eyes fixed on Ray's face, watching for any sign of what the man was thinking. Ray set the last page down and took off his glasses. He sat back in his chair and let out a slow breath through his nose. "How old are you, son?" he asked Oliver. 9, Oliver said. Ray nodded once, like that answered something beyond just the question. "Your mother put these together herself?" "Yes, sir," Oliver said. "She kept them in a box in her closet. She told me if anything ever happened to her and I felt scared, I should take the box and find someone I trusted." Ray was quiet for a moment. "She sounds like she was a smart woman." Oliver's voice was steady but small. "She was." Ray looked at Frank. "This is real. The transfer patterns are clear. The account names line up. Whoever moved this money wasn't even particularly careful about hiding it, probably because they never expected anyone to look closely." He tapped the folder with 2 fingers. "This needs to go to the State Financial Crimes Unit, not local. State. You want people who don't have any ties to whoever this Bennett family knows in the county." Frank agreed with that without hesitation. Local had too many variables. "Can you make the contact?" Frank asked. "I can make a call tonight," Ray said. "I still know a few people over there. Good people." He looked at Oliver again, with an expression that wasn't quite a smile, but was close to one. "You did a brave thing holding on to this." Oliver didn't respond right away. He stared at the folder for a moment, and then looked up. "Do you think it'll actually do anything?" Ray leaned forward and rested his elbows on his knees. "I've seen flimsier evidence than this put people away," he said plainly. "I'm not going to make you promises I can't keep. But I'll tell you this. It matters. What you're holding matters." Oliver gave a short nod and looked down at his hands again. They stayed another 20 minutes. Ray made notes and took photographs of each document with his phone. He told Frank to keep the originals safe and to stay off the main roads for now. They were back in Frank's truck as the late afternoon sky turned a deep gray overhead. Frank clicked on the radio for some background noise while he drove. They were about 15 minutes down the road when the station cut from music to a local news break. Oliver went completely still. His grandfather's voice came through the speaker first. Calm, smooth, carefully sad. Then the truck's small display screen lit up as Frank connected to a station streaming the broadcast. Charles Bennett stood at a podium in a dark suit, with his hands clasped in front of him and his eyes wet at the edges. Behind him were reporters and cameras and soft evening light coming through tall windows. "My grandson is all I have left," he said. his voice catching just right. "He's a frightened little boy who has lost his mother. We just want him home safe. Please, if anyone has seen Oliver, please call the number on your screen." A photograph of Oliver appeared beside the broadcast. His school picture, a blue background, and a hesitant smile. Frank reached over and turned the radio down. He didn't look at Oliver right away. He kept his eyes on the road. But in the silence that followed, he heard the boy's breathing change. They had moved before midnight. Frank hadn't liked staying in one place after the broadcast. Too easy to be spotted. Too easy for someone watching the news to put things together and make a phone call. So he had woken Oliver gently, packed up the room, and driven another hour and a half south on back roads until he found a different motel. This one sat at the edge of a truck stop off a state highway. The kind of place where nobody asked questions, and the parking lot stayed busy enough that one extra truck blended right in. The room smelled like old carpet and pine cleaner. 2 beds, a small television bolted to the dresser, and a window with a heavy curtain that Oliver had pulled almost shut the moment they walked in. He was still cautious, still watching. Frank noticed that even in sleep, the boy kept one hand touching the backpack beside him. By morning, the rain had stopped. Thin winter sunlight pressed through the edge of the curtain and put a pale strip of light across the floor. Frank had been up for an hour already, sitting in the chair by the window with a gas station coffee going cold in his hand. Oliver woke up quietly, the way kids did when they had gotten used to being careful. He sat up, looked around the room once to get his bearings, and then looked at Frank. "Anything happen?" Oliver asked. "Nothing," Frank said. Oliver relaxed his shoulders slightly and reached for the remote. The news was already covering it. A morning anchor with a bright smile introduced the segment as a follow-up to the previous evening's story. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, "Community rallies behind grieving grandfather in search for missing boy." Then the full interview aired. Someone had sat Charles Bennett down in a well-lit room with soft furniture and a bookshelf in the background. He wore a gray sweater instead of a suit this time. The choice was deliberate. He looked like someone's grandfather. He looked warm. The interviewer was gentle. "Tell us about Oliver," she said. Charles Bennett looked down at his hands for a moment before answering. It was a practiced pause, but it looked real. "He's extraordinary," he said quietly. "His mother raised him to be kind and curious and good. She was extraordinary, too." He stopped, pressed his lips together. "Losing her the way we did, it broke all of us, and Oliver most of all." He reached up and touched the corner of his eye with one finger. The camera stayed on his face. "I just want my grandson home," he said. "Whatever he's been told, whatever fear brought him out there alone, I want him to know that I love him, that's all. I just want him safe." The interview cut to a phone line number and a community tip website. Then it cut to local residents being interviewed on a sidewalk somewhere. A woman in a winter coat shook her head at the camera. "That poor man. You can see it on his face. He's heartbroken." An older man beside her nodded. "Hope they find that boy soon and get him home where he belongs." Oliver turned the television off. He set the remote down carefully on the mattress and sat looking at the blank screen for a moment. Then he pulled his knees up to his chest and wrapped his arms around them. Frank watched the boy. He didn't say anything right away because there was nothing quick or easy to say. He had seen a lot of things in his life. He had dealt with people who played rough and people who played dirty. But watching a man use a television camera like a weapon against a 9-year-old child was something else entirely. Charles Bennett had not raised his voice once during that interview. He had not made a single accusation. He had simply sat in a warm sweater and looked sad, and that had been enough. The whole country was on his side now. And somewhere in that same country, Frank was a large tattooed biker traveling alone with someone else's missing grandchild. He understood exactly how that looked. The day stretched out long and slow. Frank had spoken to the retired officer again that morning. The state investigators were reviewing the documents. That was the word being used. Reviewing? It was a careful word, a word that meant nothing was happening yet. "How long?" Frank had asked. "Could be today. Could be a few days. These things move slow when money's involved." Frank had thanked him and hung up. He looked over at Oliver, who was sitting cross-legged on his bed with the backpack open beside him. The boy was carefully going through each document again, one by one, the way someone might count coins to make sure none were missing. "They're still working on it," Frank said. Oliver nodded without looking up. "Okay." Just okay. No complaint. No panic. Frank had noticed that about him. Oliver didn't waste energy on things he couldn't control. For a 9-year-old, that was something. Frank pulled on his jacket. "Come on, we're not sitting in this room all day." Oliver looked up then. A flicker of worry crossed his face. "I'll keep you off the main roads," Frank said simply. Oliver thought about it for a second. Then he zipped the backpack shut and stood up. They found a small park about a mile from the motel. It sat behind a public library and a post office, tucked away from the main street. A few old oak trees stood bare against the pale sky. A wooden bench sat near a dry fountain. Nobody else was around. They sat on the bench together. Frank drank coffee from a paper cup. Oliver had a hot chocolate he'd picked from the gas station rack, both hands wrapped around it. For a while, neither of them said much. A bird landed near the fountain and pecked at the ground. Oliver watched it. "My mom used to bring me to a park," he said. "Not like this one. Bigger. There was a slide that got really hot in summer." "Burned the back of your legs?" Frank asked. Oliver almost smiled. "Every single time, and I kept going down it anyway." "That's the thing about slides," Frank said. Oliver glanced at him. This time the almost smile turned into a real one, brief and quiet. Then he looked back at the bird. "Can I ask you something?" Oliver said. "Oliver, go ahead. Do people ever get scared of you?" Frank looked down at his coffee cup. The tattoos on the back of his hand were visible. A chain, an eagle, names he carried that nobody ever asked about politely. "Yeah," he said. "Pretty often." "Because of how you look?" "Mostly." Oliver seemed to think about that. "Does it bother you?" Frank was quiet for a moment. An honest question deserved an honest answer. "Used to bother me more than it does now," he said. "When I was younger, I thought if I just kept to myself enough, people would stop assuming things. Took me a long time to figure out that wasn't really the problem." "What was the problem?" "Fear," Frank said. "People see something they don't recognize, and they decide it's dangerous. Doesn't matter if it is or not. They've already made up their mind." Oliver turned that over slowly. So they never find out they're wrong. "Not usually, because they don't stick around long enough." "That seems lonely," Oliver said. Frank looked at the boy. Oliver was watching him with steady eyes. Not pitying, just honest. "It is," Frank said simply. Oliver looked back at the fountain. The bird had gone. The park was quiet around them. "You didn't walk away from me," Oliver said. "At the station. You could have." "I could have," Frank agreed. "Why didn't you?" Frank thought about it. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because he wanted to find the right words. "Because you looked like you needed somebody to stay," he said. Oliver was quiet for a long moment. Then he pulled his hot chocolate closer and asked, What are the names? The ones on your hand? The motel room felt smaller at night. Frank had turned on the small lamp in the corner, the one with the yellow shade that made everything look warm and old at the same time. Oliver sat on the edge of his bed with his sock feet on the floor, turning the zipper pull on his backpack around and around in his fingers. Frank was at the small table with a road map spread open in front of him. He wasn't really reading it, just giving Oliver some quiet. Then Oliver said, "I have an aunt." Frank looked up from the map. He waited. "My mom's sister," Oliver continued. "Her name is Eleanor, Aunt Eleanor." He said it like the name tasted familiar but distant, like something he hadn't let himself think about in a while. "You close with her?" Frank asked. Oliver shook his head slowly. "My grandfather didn't like us seeing her much. He said she was difficult, that she caused problems." He paused. "But my mom used to call her when Grandpa wasn't home. They'd talk for a long time. Mom would always look happier after." Frank folded one corner of the map down. "What do you think of her?" Oliver's expression softened. "She came to my birthday once. I was turning 7. She brought me a book about space and sat on the floor with me and read the whole first chapter out loud." He looked down at the zipper pull. "She smelled like old paper and peppermint." Frank almost smiled at that. "Sounds like a librarian." Oliver looked up quickly. "She is. How did you know?" "Lucky guess?" Oliver set the backpack down beside him. "Grandpa sent her away before the cake. They argued in the kitchen and she left. Mom cried a little later. She thought I didn't notice." He was quiet for a second. "I noticed." Frank leaned back in his chair. The lamp threw a soft shadow across the wall behind him. "Do you think Eleanor would believe you?" Frank asked. "About the documents. About what your grandfather did." Oliver didn't hesitate. "Yes. I think she already knew something was wrong. She just didn't have proof." He looked at the backpack on the bed beside him. "Mom talked to her about the charity once. I heard them. Mom said money was disappearing and she didn't know who to trust." Frank was quiet. He thought about the retired officer. He thought about the state investigators and their careful word. Reviewing. He thought about a school librarian who smelled like old paper and peppermint and read about space on a birthday floor. "Do you know how to reach her?" Frank asked. Oliver thought hard. "She lives in Clover Falls. I know that much. Mom wrote letters sometimes. I don't know the address." He looked frustrated with himself. "I should know the address." "You're 9, Frank said. "Oh, you're doing fine." He pulled out his phone and typed the name into the search bar. Eleanor Bennett, Clover Falls. He found a library staff page within 2 minutes. Her photograph was small and a little blurry, but she was smiling. She had dark hair pulled back and glasses, and looked very much like someone who would sit on a floor and read about space. Then something else caught his eye. A local news post, Clover Falls Gazette, 3 days old. He read the headline once, then again. He set the phone down carefully on the table. "Oliver," he said. The boy looked up. "Your aunt has been looking for you." Oliver went very still. Frank turned the phone around so the boy could see the screen. The headline read, "Local librarian pleads for information on missing nephew." Oliver stared at it. His lips pressed together, and his eyes filled up fast. He blinked hard and looked at the ceiling for a second, the way kids do when they don't want to cry. Frank picked the phone back up. "I'm going to make some calls," he said. "See if we can find her directly. No middlemen." Oliver nodded without speaking. Frank stepped toward the door, then stopped. "Kid, she didn't stop looking?" Oliver looked at him. Frank nodded once. Then he stepped outside to make the call. The morning came in pale and quiet. Frank had barely slept. He sat in the chair by the door again, the same one from the night before, with a cold cup of coffee on the floor beside him. Oliver was still asleep when the first gray light came through the gap in the curtains. The boy was curled on his side with one hand tucked under his cheek, looking younger than 9, looking like a kid who had finally let himself rest. Frank didn't wake him right away. He sat there a while longer, watching the light change, thinking about the phone call from the night before. The woman on the other end had answered on the second ring. Her voice was careful at first, guarded, the way people get when they've been disappointed too many times. But when Frank said Oliver's name, everything changed. She hadn't cried. Not exactly. But her breath had caught hard, like something inside her had been clenched tight for days and finally let go just a little. They had talked for 20 minutes. The retired officer had helped coordinate a meeting point with a state investigator named Bauer, a woman Frank had spoken to briefly the day before. Neutral ground, a small municipal building in a town called Reed's Crossing, about 40 miles east. Public enough to be safe, private enough to talk. Frank had written the address on the back of a gas receipt and folded it into his jacket pocket. At 7 in the morning, he woke Oliver. Reed's Crossing was a small town that looked like it hadn't changed much in 30 years. Main Street had a hardware store, a diner with a hand-painted sign, and a post office the size of a living room. The municipal building was at the far end, a single-story brick building with an American flag out front that moved slowly in the cool morning air. Frank parked the truck he had borrowed from his motel contact. Oliver sat in the passenger seat and didn't say much on the drive over. He just watched the fields go past the window with his backpack on his lap and his hands folded over the top of it. When the building came into view, Oliver sat up straighter. There was a woman standing outside the front door. She was wearing a gray coat and had dark hair pulled back. Even from the parking lot, Frank could see she was watching the truck. The moment it stopped, she took 2 steps forward and then made herself stop, like she was trying not to run. Oliver saw her and made a small sound. He had the door open before Frank even turned off the engine. "Hey," Frank said. "Take a breath." Oliver nodded. He took a breath. Then he got out. Eleanor met him halfway across the parking lot. She dropped to her knees right there on the cracked asphalt and put both arms around him and held on. Oliver pressed his face into her shoulder and grabbed fistfuls of her coat and didn't let go. Frank stayed by the truck. He watched the two of them and felt something quiet move through his chest. He looked away after a moment, gave them their space. When Oliver finally pulled back, Eleanor was holding his face in both hands and looking him over like she needed to be sure he was real. Her eyes were red, but her voice was steady. "I've been looking everywhere," she said. "Every single day." "I know," Oliver said. "Frank showed me." She looked up at Frank for the first time. He gave her a small nod from where he stood. She mouthed the words, "Thank you." Then she looked back at Oliver. Inside the building, Investigator Bauer gave them a quiet room with a table and 4 chairs. Eleanor sat beside Oliver and listened to everything. She asked careful questions. She looked at the documents from the backpack one by one, holding each page like it was something precious. When Oliver finished talking, Eleanor set the last page down slowly. "Your mother called me," she said, "about 6 weeks before she died. She told me she had found something. That money was missing from the charity accounts. A lot of it." She paused. She said she was afraid of what would happen if she said anything out loud. Investigator Bauer spent the better part of the afternoon at the table, with the documents spread out in front of her. She worked slowly and carefully, reading each page twice before setting it aside. She had a yellow notepad and a pen, and she wrote things down in small, neat handwriting. Frank sat outside the room on a wooden bench in the hallway. He could hear the low murmur of voices through the door, but couldn't make out the words. Oliver was in there with Eleanor and Bauer. He had insisted on explaining everything himself in his own words, and nobody had argued with him. The hallway was quiet. A clock on the wall ticked steadily. Frank stretched his legs out in front of him and leaned his head back against the wall and stared at the ceiling. He thought about the road, about the trip he had been taking before all of this started. He couldn't even remember where he had been headed. Some town he had passed through before, years ago. No real reason. Just moving, the way he sometimes did when sitting still felt like too much. The door opened an hour later. Bauer stepped out first. She looked at Frank with an expression that was hard to read. "The documents are consistent with what the boy described," she said. "We're going to need to bring in additional investigators. This is bigger than a local matter." She paused. "You did right by him." Frank nodded once. He didn't say anything. Eleanor appeared behind Bauer with Oliver at her side. Oliver looked wrung out, but somehow lighter at the same time, like he had been carrying something very heavy and had finally been allowed to set it down in someone else's hands. The paperwork for Eleanor's temporary custody was simple and quick. Bauer had prepared it in advance, which meant someone had been working hard behind the scenes. Within the hour, it was signed and official. Oliver was no longer alone in the eyes of the law. Eleanor put her arm around his shoulders as they walked outside. Oliver leaned into her just slightly. They found a small restaurant on the edge of town. It had red vinyl booths and laminated menus and a specials board written in chalk. The kind of place where the coffee came automatically, and nobody looked twice at a heavily tattooed biker sitting across from a librarian and a 9-year-old boy. Frank ordered the meatloaf. Oliver ordered a cheeseburger and ate every bite of it, plus most of his fries. Eleanor had soup and kept stealing glances at Oliver when she thought he wasn't looking, like she still needed to reassure herself that he was really there. The conversation moved the way conversations do when people are still finding their footing with each other. Oliver told Eleanor about the diner where Frank had taken him that first morning. He described the pancakes with some enthusiasm. Eleanor smiled and looked at Frank. "He ate 4 of them," Frank said. "4," Eleanor repeated. She raised her eyebrows at Oliver. "I was hungry," Oliver said, perfectly serious. Eleanor laughed. It was a real laugh, warm and unguarded. Frank found himself smiling without meaning to. They talked through the meal and into the coffee afterward. The restaurant thinned out around them as the evening settled in. The chalk specials board lost its audience. The waitress refilled their cups without being asked. Frank sat back in the booth and looked at the two of them across the table. Eleanor was helping Oliver with the straw wrapper, folding it into a small accordion shape the way kids like. Oliver was concentrating on it like it was important work. Something moved through Frank quietly, a feeling he hadn't felt in a long time. He didn't have a perfect word for it. It just felt like things being okay. Like maybe, somewhere past all the mess still ahead of them, things could actually work out. Oliver looked up from the straw wrapper. "Are you going to stay around?" he asked. "Like after everything?" Frank looked at him. The boy's eyes were steady and honest and waiting. "Yeah," Frank said. "I'll stay around." Oliver nodded like that settled it. He went back to the straw wrapper. The morning came in clean and bright. Frank noticed it when he stepped outside the motel just after 7. The rain from the past few days had cleared out completely. The sky was pale blue and wide open. The parking lot was still damp, but the air had that fresh, washed-out smell that follows a long storm. He stood there for a moment with his coffee cup and just breathed. Inside, Oliver was still asleep. Eleanor had taken the room next door. Frank could hear the low sound of a television through the wall. Normal sounds. Safe sounds. Investigator Bauer called at 8:15. "We've got 2 more people reviewing the financial records this morning," she said. "State level. They're taking this seriously." She sounded focused and steady. "Just sit tight. Let us do our work." Frank told her he understood. He hung up and looked at the phone for a second, and then put it in his pocket. When Oliver woke up, Frank walked him over to Eleanor's room, and the 3 of them had breakfast from a vending machine down the hall and a coffee maker on the dresser. It wasn't much. Oliver didn't seem to care. He sat cross-legged on Eleanor's bed and ate a pack of peanut butter crackers and talked about whether motorcycles were hard to learn. Eleanor caught Frank's eye over Oliver's head and gave him a small, grateful smile. The morning felt almost normal. That was the word for it. Normal. Frank allowed himself to believe, just for that morning, that normal might actually be coming. The first call that changed things came just after noon. Bauer's voice was different this time. Flatter, more careful. "We've run into a problem," she said. "Some of the financial records that were submitted yesterday, the printed pages from the backpack, 3 of them can't be verified. The originals appear to have been accessed and altered in the system they were pulled from." Frank stepped away from the motel room door so Oliver wouldn't hear. "Altered how?" he said. "Someone changed the source files. The printed copies Oliver had don't match what's on the server now." She paused. "It doesn't mean the documents are fake. It means someone got to the server before us." Frank pressed his hand flat against the outside wall of the motel. The concrete was rough and warm from the sun. "What does that do to the case?" he asked. "It complicates it," Bauer said. "Significantly." By mid-afternoon, it got worse. The retired officer, Ray, who had first reviewed the documents and agreed to speak on record, called Frank directly. His voice was tight and unhappy. "I got a visit this morning," Ray said. 2 attorneys from a firm out of the city. They had paperwork suggesting I had improperly handled evidence by reviewing it outside of official channels. He stopped. "Frank, I've known you for 15 years and I believe that boy, but they're threatening my pension. I've got grandkids." Frank closed his eyes. "I understand," he said. He meant it. Ray didn't say anything for a moment, then quietly, "I'm sorry." The evening news ran a new segment at 6 o'clock. Frank and Eleanor watched it from her room, while Oliver sat at the small table nearby, doing a word search puzzle Eleanor had found in a gas station bag she brought from the car. Frank had asked her to keep Oliver from watching, and she had managed it without making it obvious. On the screen, a sharp-looking attorney in a dark suit stood at a podium. Behind him, slightly out of focus, was Charles Bennett. Looking tired. Looking like a grandfather who had been through too much. The attorney spoke clearly and without rushing. He said the evidence being cited by investigators had been handled improperly from the beginning. He said a minor child had been taken from his family by a person with a documented criminal history. He said the so-called documents were unverifiable. He used the word manipulation twice. He used the phrase vulnerable grieving child once. Then he looked directly into the camera. "My client simply wants his grandson home safely," the attorney said. Eleanor turned the television off. The next morning brought no relief. Frank was up before sunrise. He sat in the plastic chair by the window and watched the parking lot fill slowly with light. A delivery truck rumbled past on the highway. A dog barked somewhere distant, and then went quiet. The world outside looked ordinary, calm, like nothing was wrong at all. But his phone had been buzzing since before 5. He had stopped answering numbers he didn't recognize around the 3rd call. By the 6th, he put the phone face down on the nightstand and just listened to it hum against the wood. Eleanor knocked on his door at 7:30, with Oliver beside her and 2 gas station coffees in her hands. She passed one through the door and looked at his face, and didn't ask how he slept. "It's getting louder," she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were tired. "I know," Frank said. Oliver looked between them. He was good at reading rooms, that boy. He had learned it the hard way. He didn't say anything. He just stood close to Eleanor with his backpack over one shoulder and watched Frank the way he had watched the door back at the bus station. Like he was calculating something, preparing himself. Frank hated seeing that look on a 9-year-old's face. Eleanor had found a small rental cabin about 20 minutes outside of town through a woman she trusted from work. They relocated after breakfast. The cabin sat back from the road behind a wall of pine trees and smelled like wood and old quilts. It was simple and quiet, and far enough from town that nobody was driving past by accident. Frank carried their bags in and checked every door and window out of habit. Eleanor set up her laptop at the kitchen table. Oliver sat beside her. Frank leaned against the doorframe with his coffee and watched the screen as she pulled up the morning's headlines. The stories had changed. The day before, the coverage had been about the investigation, about the charity, about the missing funds. Those words were still there, but they had moved further down in the articles now, buried under newer sentences, newer questions. The questions were about Frank. One outlet had pulled his full name from a public record and paired it with an old photograph. It was not a kind photograph. It had been taken years ago and showed him outside a bar in his vest and colors, arms crossed, expression hard. He remembered the day vaguely. He had not been doing anything wrong. He had just looked like himself. The headline beneath it read, "Who is the biker at the center of the Bennett child case?" Another story listed things. Clubs he had been associated with. A misdemeanor charge from over 20 years ago that had been resolved and expunged, but apparently not forgotten. The word criminal appeared 3 times before the second paragraph ended. Eleanor pushed the laptop slightly away from her, like she couldn't stand looking at it anymore. "They're not talking about my father," she said quietly. "They're talking about you." At 11 o'clock, Charles Bennett gave a second interview. This one was not at a podium. It was filmed outside, in what looked like a garden, soft light and flowers visible behind him. He wore a simple gray sweater. He looked like somebody's grandfather. He looked like he was in pain. The interviewer asked him directly about the man who had been with his grandson. Charles Bennett took a slow breath. He looked down at his hands. Then he looked back up, and his eyes were wet. "I don't want to speak unkindly about anyone," he said. "But I have to be honest. My daughter passed away not long ago. My grandson was alone and grieving and frightened. A child in that condition is—" He paused and shook his head slowly. "A child like that can be guided, can be influenced, by the wrong kind of person." He did not say Frank's name. He didn't have to. By noon, Frank's face was on every channel. Not as a protector, not as a witness, as the problem. The days that followed were hard in a way that wore on people quietly. Not loud and sudden like a storm. More like water finding its way through stone, slow, steady, relentless. Monday brought another meeting with investigators in a narrow conference room that smelled like burnt coffee and carpet cleaner. Eleanor sat on one side of the table with a local attorney named Patricia Owens, a small, serious woman who spoke carefully and never wasted a word. Frank sat beside them. Oliver waited in an outer office with a kind receptionist who gave him a granola bar and let him draw on the back of some printed forms. The investigators were not unfriendly, but they kept asking the same questions in different ways. Where exactly had Frank been before the bus station? How had he and Oliver communicated? Had anyone else been present when the documents were examined? Their eyes moved between Frank and the notes on their pads, and back again. Patricia pushed back firmly each time the questioning drifted toward Frank's character. But every pushback cost time. Time they didn't have enough of. They left the building 2 hours later, having answered everything and gained nothing new. Tuesday brought a phone call from the lead investigator. A contact who had provided a written statement was now saying he had misremembered certain details. Not everything. Just enough to weaken the sequence of events surrounding the missing financial records. Eleanor stood at the kitchen counter of the cabin with the phone pressed to her ear. She didn't raise her voice. She just got very still. Frank watched her from across the room and recognized that kind of stillness. It was the stillness of someone working very hard not to fall apart. Wednesday brought more news coverage. 2 different opinion pieces ran online, suggesting the entire charity theft accusation was a story created to distract from what they called a deeply troubling situation involving a grieving child and an unknown adult with a documented criminal history. The misdemeanor from over 2 decades ago was mentioned again. In one piece, it was described as part of a pattern. Frank read the words once. Then he set his phone down and went outside and split firewood behind the cabin for 40 minutes until his shoulders burned. Oliver watched him through the back window. He didn't say anything, but he watched. Thursday brought Patricia back to the cabin with a folder of documents and a long, quiet conversation at the kitchen table that stretched into the evening. Charles Bennett's attorneys had filed a formal request for Oliver to be returned to his grandfather's custody, while the investigation remained open. The filing described Oliver as a minor in an unstable and unsupervised environment. Eleanor's jaw tightened when she read that part. She set the paper flat on the table and pressed both hands against it like she was holding it down. "Can he actually get custody?" she asked Patricia. Patricia chose her next words carefully. "He has resources. He has a very practiced team of attorneys. And right now our strongest evidence has gaps." She did not say yes. She did not say no. But the answer was somewhere in the space between. Oliver was supposed to be asleep. His room was at the end of the short hallway, just past the bathroom. The door was not fully closed, and the voices from the kitchen carried farther than the adults realized. He lay on his side on the narrow bed with the quilt pulled up to his chin and his backpack on the floor beside him. He had stopped sleeping deeply days ago. His body was tired, but his mind would not let go. He heard Patricia's voice first. Something about the timeline, something about the gaps. Then Eleanor, quieter, asking what happened if the backup files weren't enough. Then Patricia again, measured and honest, explaining that a man with Charles Bennett's connections and legal team had survived worse accusations before. Oliver stared at the wall. His mom had started the charity. His grandfather had stolen from it. Oliver had taken the documents. He had run. He had ended up at that bus station. He had brought Frank into all of this. And now Frank was on the news. Eleanor was fighting attorneys. Patricia was talking about gaps. Because of him. He pulled the quilt up over his face and lay very still. The boxes had been sitting in the corner of Eleanor's bedroom for 2 weeks, 3 of them, cardboard. The flaps folded shut and held down by strips of packing tape that had started to yellow at the edges. Eleanor had carried them from her car the day she picked them up from the storage unit, and she had not opened them since. She told herself she was waiting for the right moment. The truth was, she wasn't sure she was ready. But that Thursday evening, after Patricia left and the cabin grew quiet and the weight of the day settled over everything like a heavy blanket, Eleanor looked at Oliver sitting at the kitchen table staring at nothing, and she made a decision. "Hey," she said softly. "Want to help me with something?" Oliver looked up. His eyes were tired. "What kind of something?" "Your mom's things." She paused. "I think it's time." He was quiet for a moment. Then he pushed back his chair and followed her down the hall. Frank stayed in the kitchen. He poured himself a coffee he didn't really want and sat with it near the window, giving them space. That was something he had learned over the years. Some moments belonged to certain people and nobody else. You didn't crowd them. You just stayed close enough in case you were needed. He could hear Eleanor and Oliver moving around in the bedroom, the soft tear of tape, the low creak of cardboard flaps being folded back. Quiet voices. He sipped his coffee and watched the dark tree line through the glass. The first box held mostly practical things. A folded tablecloth with small blue flowers printed along the border. A set of measuring cups nested inside each other. A small framed cross-stitch that read, "Home is wherever love is," in uneven stitching that suggested someone had made it by hand a long time ago. Oliver touched each item carefully, like they might break or disappear. Eleanor held up the cross-stitch. "Your grandmother made this, before you were born." She smiled faintly. "Your mom kept it in every kitchen she ever had." Oliver looked at it for a long moment. "Mom never told me that." "She probably figured there was time." Eleanor set it gently on the bed. Her voice stayed steady, but her eyes didn't quite match. The second box held paperwork and books. Eleanor sorted through them with practiced focus, her librarian habits showing in the way she organized things into small stacks. Oliver sat cross-legged on the floor beside the box and helped lift things out. A journal, a well-worn copy of a novel with a cracked spine. Envelopes held together with a rubber band. Near the bottom of that second box, wrapped loosely in a square of soft cloth, were photographs. Not digital, real printed photographs. The kind with slightly glossy surfaces and white borders, and the date stamped on the back in faded orange numbers. Oliver unwrapped the cloth carefully. There were maybe 30 pictures. He held them in both hands and began going through them slowly. There was his mom at what looked like a picnic, laughing at someone off to the side. Her hair was longer than Oliver remembered it. There was one of Eleanor and his mom together when they were young, standing in front of a Christmas tree. There was one of Oliver himself as a baby, asleep in someone's arms. He paused on that one for a moment, then kept going. Near the bottom of the small stack, one photograph stopped him completely. It was older than the others. The colors had faded slightly toward yellow at the edges. In the background, a dark stretch of road at night. On the side of that road, a small car with its hood raised. His mother was standing beside the car. She looked younger. Maybe not by a huge number of years, but younger in the way people look before life gets heavy. She was smiling. Not a big smile. More like the kind a person makes when they are relieved and grateful at the same time. And beside her, crouched near the front tire, with one hand braced against the bumper, was a large man. Broad shoulders, dark hair, his forearms covered in tattoos. Oliver's breath caught. He knew that face. Oliver stared at the photograph for a long time without saying anything. Eleanor noticed. She leaned over gently and looked at the picture in his hands. She went very still. "Where did that come from?" she whispered. "It was in the stack." Oliver turned it over. The back had a date stamped in faded orange numbers. Then, below the date, written in blue pen in his mother's careful handwriting, 3 words. He stopped. Kindness. Oliver read it twice. His throat felt tight. Eleanor sat down slowly on the edge of the bed. She reached into the box again and lifted out the journal. She had set it aside earlier without opening it. Now she held it in both hands and looked at Oliver. "Can I?" she asked quietly. Oliver nodded. She opened it to somewhere near the middle, where a folded piece of paper had been tucked between the pages like a bookmark. She unfolded it carefully. It was a letter, written by hand. His mother's writing again, the same looping cursive from the back of the photograph. Eleanor read it silently first. Her expression changed slowly the way a sky changes before rain. Something moving beneath the surface. Then she looked at Oliver. "Do you want me to read it out loud?" He nodded again. Eleanor cleared her throat softly and began. "I've been thinking about the night my car broke down on Route 9. It was late, and it was cold, and I was scared. Dozens of cars passed me. Every single one. And then this big motorcycle pulled over. This man got out who looked like someone most people would cross the street to avoid. Tattoos everywhere. Leather jacket. Huge. Honestly, my first instinct was to be frightened. But he just said, 'You okay? I can change that tire.' That was it. No big speech. No making me feel like I owed him anything. He just got down on the ground in the cold and fixed it. He waited with me until I felt safe enough to drive. When I tried to thank him, he just shrugged and said, 'Anybody would have stopped?' But they didn't. He did. I took his picture because I wanted to remember. Not just him. The feeling. The reminder that kindness doesn't always look the way you expect it to. Sometimes it shows up in the people the rest of the world has already decided to be afraid of." Eleanor paused. She turned the page. "I tell Oliver this story sometimes. I want him to understand it before he gets old enough to forget how to see people clearly. I tell him that if he is ever truly scared, really scared, he should look past the surface. Look for someone who seems tough but acts gentle. Someone who stays when everyone else keeps walking. That is where the real safety is. That is where the good ones are." Eleanor's voice had gone quiet by the end. She folded the letter back along its original creases and held it gently in her lap. The bedroom was very still. Oliver looked down at the photograph again. The man crouching by the tire, the big shoulders, the tattooed arms, his mother standing beside the car with that small, relieved smile. "I knew," Oliver said. Eleanor looked at him. "What do you mean?" "At the bus station." His voice was barely above a whisper. "When he first walked in, I saw him from across the room and I knew it was him." He pressed his lips together. "Mom showed me this picture. Not a lot, but enough. And she always told me the story when she told me about being kind." He paused. "I was scared of everybody that day, but when I saw him, I thought maybe Mom sent him." Eleanor made a soft sound. Not quite words. She reached over and put her arm around Oliver's shoulders and pulled him close. Oliver let her. He kept holding the photograph with both hands, looking at it the way a person looks at something they have been carrying inside them for a long time, without realizing it had a shape. Oliver had fallen asleep on the couch with the photograph still loosely held in one hand. Eleanor had tucked a blanket around him without waking him. She stood there for a moment, looking at his face. Peaceful for once. Soft in a way it hadn't been since she first saw him again. Then she turned back to the boxes. She couldn't sleep. She had tried sitting down and closing her eyes, and she had tried making tea, and she had tried just breathing slowly the way her doctor once told her to. None of it worked. Her mind kept circling back to the letter, to her sister's voice inside those carefully written words, to the fact that her sister had known something was wrong and had been quietly preparing, documenting, trying to protect something. Eleanor believed with her whole chest that her sister had not finished, that there was more. She pulled the nearest box closer and sat cross-legged on the floor beside it. Her sister had always been organized, almost obsessively so. She color-coded her calendar. She kept receipts for everything. She backed up her phone every single Sunday without fail. Eleanor used to tease her about it, said she was the only person alive who actually read the terms and conditions before clicking agree. She smiled at the memory. Then the smile faded into something quieter. She started working through the papers methodically. Bank statements, printed emails, meeting notes written on yellow legal pads with bullet points and small, neat check marks. Eleanor read each one carefully. Most of it she had already seen. The investigators had copies of everything in these boxes. That was the problem. The copies that had mattered were the ones that had disappeared from the official case, but her sister had been the kind of person who made backups of her backups. Eleanor kept going. Around midnight, she found a small zippered pouch tucked into the corner of the third box beneath a folded sweater that still smelled faintly of her sister's perfume. Eleanor held the sweater for just a moment. She pressed it briefly against her face. Then she set it aside and opened the pouch. Inside was a folded receipt from an electronics store, dated about 8 months before her sister died. A portable wireless hard drive, the kind that connected to home networks. Eleanor turned the receipt over. Her sister had written a website address on the back in pencil. Below that, a username. Below that, a small drawing of a cloud with an arrow pointing up. Eleanor stared at it. Cloud storage. A separate account. Not the one the investigators had already found and combed through. A different one entirely. The username was not her sister's name or her email address or anything obvious. It was the name of their childhood dog, followed by a number Eleanor recognized immediately as their mother's birthday. Something nobody outside this family would ever guess. Eleanor grabbed her laptop from the kitchen counter and came back to the floor. Her hands were not entirely steady as she typed in the website address from the receipt. The page loaded slowly. A plain login screen. Nothing fancy. She typed the username. She typed the password. She held her breath. The page shifted. A loading circle spun for what felt like a very long time. Then the screen filled with folders. Dozens of them. Each one labeled with a date and a short description in her sister's handwriting style, even translated into typed text. Charity board meetings, wire transfers, donor records, internal communications. Eleanor opened the first folder. The files inside were complete, untouched. Every transaction, every email chain, every record of money moved from the charity's accounts into private ones connected to her father. Her father's name appeared again and again and again. She kept opening folders, each one more detailed than the last. Her sister had been building this for months. Quietly, carefully, the way she did everything. Making sure that if something happened to the original copies, these would still exist. Eleanor sat back against the side of the couch. Oliver shifted in his sleep above her but didn't wake. She looked at the screen. It was all there. Every single piece of it. Eleanor did not sleep. She sat on the floor with her laptop open until the first pale light began showing through the kitchen window. She had gone through every folder, every file. She had made notes on a yellow legal pad and organized everything the same careful way her sister always had. By the time Oliver stirred on the couch and rubbed his eyes, she had already called the lead investigator twice and left detailed messages both times. The third call went through. "I found something," she said. "You need to come this morning." They arrived before 9. 2 investigators in plain clothes and a third man Eleanor did not recognize who carried a laptop bag and spoke very little. He sat down at the kitchen table, opened his equipment, and went straight to work without ceremony. Eleanor gave him the website address and stood back. The room was quiet except for the sound of keys clicking and the occasional soft beep from his machine. Oliver sat beside Frank on the small couch near the window. Frank had arrived 20 minutes after Eleanor called him. He had not asked many questions on the phone. He had just said he was coming, and then he came. Oliver leaned slightly into Frank's arm, without seeming to notice he was doing it. Frank noticed. He didn't say anything about it. The man with the laptop looked up after several minutes. "These files are intact," he said. "Metadata is clean. Timestamps match. Nothing's been altered." One of the investigators leaned over his shoulder and studied the screen. She straightened up slowly and looked at Eleanor. "This is everything we needed," she said. Eleanor let out a long breath. Her eyes filled, but she blinked it back. She pressed her lips together and nodded once. "My sister made sure of it," she said quietly. Oliver was watching from the couch. Frank felt the boy sit up a little straighter. It moved quickly after that. Within 2 hours, federal investigators had been contacted, and the files had been transferred through secure channels. The lead investigator made several calls from the small back hallway, while the rest of them waited. Her voice was low and professional, but Eleanor could hear the pace of it, the urgency underneath the calm tone. By midday, the energy in the room had shifted into something purposeful, something that felt, for the first time, like it was pointing in the right direction. Ross and Tyler were located separately. Ross was picked up at a diner 3 towns over where he had been staying since the investigation started drawing attention. He was sitting with a cup of coffee and a newspaper when 2 plain-clothed officers sat down across from him. He looked at their faces. He looked at the folder one of them placed on the table. He did not say a word for almost a full minute. Then he put down his coffee cup very carefully. "I want a lawyer," he said. Tyler was found at a motel not far from the original bus station. He opened the door when they knocked and took one look at the badges and the expressions behind them, and his face went the color of old paper. He sat down on the edge of the motel bed without being asked. They brought both men in separately. Neither one knew the other was already in custody. Each of them was shown the same evidence: the cloud files, the financial records, the emails that included their own names connected to instructions given by Charles Bennett, instructions about Oliver, about what to do if the boy talked. Ross read through the pages in front of him slowly. The investigator across the table watched his face. Something moved through it. Something that looked less like calculation and more like a man finally setting down something that had been too heavy to carry for too long. He looked up. "What do you need from me?" he said. Tyler didn't even finish reading. He pushed the folder back across the table after the 3rd page, pressed both hands flat on the surface, and said, "I'll tell you everything." The next several days moved like a river after a heavy rain. Fast, determined, impossible to stop. Federal investigators worked through the recovered files with the kind of focused patience that Charles Bennett's lawyers could not outpace or outspend. Every transaction was documented, every transfer traced back to its source. The emails were time-stamped and authenticated. The financial records matched the charity's public reports in ways that made the theft impossible to deny. Ross and Tyler had opened the door. Now everything was walking through it. Ross gave 11 hours of recorded testimony across 2 separate sessions. He sat in a plain room with a cup of water and a tired expression, and answered every question put to him. He did not try to make himself look good. He just told the truth. Tyler did the same. Their accounts matched each other almost perfectly, which told investigators everything they needed to know about how reliable the story was. Charles Bennett hired 4 lawyers, then a 5th. They filed motions and wrote letters, and held a press conference where Charles stood behind a podium, looking composed and confident, and spoke about integrity and family values. His voice did not waver. His suit was perfectly pressed. He looked directly into every camera. But the evidence did not care how polished he looked. They arrested him on a Thursday morning. It was a quiet street in front of his own home. 2 federal vehicles. 4 agents. Charles came out the front door wearing a dark coat and stopped on the top step when he saw them. For just a moment, something crossed his face that he could not control. Something that looked like the end of a very long performance. He said nothing as they walked him to the car. He looked straight ahead and kept his chin up even as the door closed behind him. The story ran on every local news channel by noon. The charity was reopened within weeks. Funds were recovered and returned. A new board was formed, made up of people Oliver's mother had trusted and worked alongside. They met in the same community center where she had once organized donation drives and holiday events for children who had very little. They hung her photograph on the wall near the entrance. Warm eyes, a genuine smile, someone who had spent her life quietly making things better for other people. They renamed the organization in her honor. Oliver stood in front of that photograph on the day of the reopening. He was quiet for a long time. Eleanor stood beside him, with her hand resting gently on his shoulder. He reached up and touched the edge of the frame very lightly. Then he nodded once, the way people do when something finally feels finished and right. Months passed. The community fundraiser was held on a Saturday in late summer. The park behind the community center was filled with long tables and folding chairs, and children running through the grass. Volunteers moved between stations handing out food and bottled water. Veterans from a local support group helped set up games for the kids. Laughter carried across the whole field. Eleanor had organized most of it. She moved through the crowd with a clipboard and a warm smile, stopping to greet everyone by name, making sure every person felt welcomed and seen. Oliver spotted Frank's motorcycle in the parking lot before he spotted Frank. He took off running across the grass at full speed. Frank barely had time to turn around before the boy hit him with both arms and held on. Frank let out a breath that sounded like it had been sitting in his chest for a long time. He wrapped his arms around Oliver and held him back just as tight. Eleanor walked over more slowly. She smiled the kind of smile that a person cannot fake. She reached out and squeezed Frank's arm. "Glad you made it," she said. "Wasn't gonna miss it," Frank said. They found seats together at one of the long tables. The 3 of them. Easy and comfortable in the way that people are when they have already been through something hard together and come out the other side. As the afternoon stretched toward evening, the sky turned a deep orange and pink above the tree line. The crowd thinned slowly. Children collected their things. Volunteers began stacking chairs. The laughter grew quieter, but did not disappear entirely. Oliver sat close beside Frank and watched the colors spread across the sky. Near the entrance to the park, a small wooden plaque had been mounted on a post earlier that day. It recognized individuals who had protected others without asking for anything in return. There were several names listed. Frank's was among them. He had not known it would be there until Eleanor pointed it out earlier. He had looked at it for a moment without speaking. Then he had nodded once and looked away, the way a person does when something hits deeper than they expected. Oliver glanced up at him now in the fading light. "You'll still come around, right?" he asked. Frank looked down at him. The corner of his mouth lifted into a slow, steady smile. "Kid," he said, "you're stuck with me now." Oliver grinned. He leaned back against Frank's arm and watched the last of the sun disappear below the trees. The park was peaceful. The air was warm. And the three of them sat together in the quiet, belonging to each other in the way that really matters. Not because of paperwork or last names, but because of everything they had walked through together and chosen not to walk away from. That was enough. That was everything. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.